Well, a hearty shalom to all of you, and kudos to you, by the way, or kudos to the Lord working in you, for were He not game to do that, you wouldn't be interested in listening to this talking head for 16 little segments. Issues associated with the book of Luke and Acts would mean nothing to you were it not for the fact that Yeshua has come to mean something to you. And so I'm appreciative of that, and appreciative too that you have surrendered some of your life to Him to become better acquainted with His Word and come to know better His will and His ways, with the net result that you'll be transformed by it and participate in transforming other people. What we have on the menu here with the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute in this 16-part series is to explore the books of Luke and Acts. And they really go together because it's the same author of both. And it's interesting that we'd be leaning on Luke in a Messianic Jewish Bible Institute course, because there's an argument that he is the only Jew who's the only person, rather, who's writing in the New Testament who's not Jewish. Some say, well, he's a doctor, he probably is part Jewish anyway. But he's really a road buddy of Paul. Paul picks Luke up on the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, so-called. He makes his entrance into the narrative. We didn't know of him before that. Paul might have known of him before that because Paul fared from Tarsus, and Tarsus sported a major medical university, if you can imagine that. It was a university town, and there was a medical school there in ancient Greco-Roman culture, and so he might have had a previous acquaintance with Luke, who's to say, but we know you can see a shift in pronouns where Luke is talking about they did this and they did that. But then when you get to the 16th chapter, as Paul is making his way through Anatolia, Asia Minor, then it's we, us, our. Luke is participating in the story. Luke will write what's called the Gospel of Luke, and then he will write a sequel to it. I call it Luke 2. It's commonly but mistakenly called the Acts of the Apostles. The reason why I say mistakenly is because A, the New Testament doesn't call it the Acts of the Apostles. The book itself doesn't call itself the Acts of the Apostles. We call it the Acts of the Apostles. And the reason why I think that's a mistake is because it doesn't talk about the Acts of the Apostles. The apostles as a group are mentioned on the front end in the first chapter, simply to say that Judas is bugged out and we need to get a replacement, that we can have 12. And after that is attended to, these apostles collectively dissolve like an Alka-Seltzer tablet dropped in a glass of water, never to be seen again in that form. We do see some of the apostle Peter, but he's going to fade away reasonably swiftly as well. And the real intention of the book becomes known that it's not really about the Acts of the Apostle. The apostles collectively, it's principally about the Acts of the Apostle Paul. And hence Luke goes on to record his various journeys, culminating finally in his finishing up in Rome. Finishing up at the end of the book. There's an argument that he gets out of that imprisonment and will travel around some more, only to make his way back to Rome again, courtesy of the empire, and be beheaded eventually. But the book of Acts, so-called, Acts of the Apostles, so-called, the misnomer has Paul finishing up at Rome here, and then, you know, his fate is uncertain. But again, as I'd said, there's an argument that he beat that rap, got out a little more, and then finally, according to church tradition, finished up in Rome, being beheaded. Well, it's not a very interesting, well, it's a tragic story to be sure, but here we're focusing on what we know, not what we guess. And we're looking at the Gospel of Luke, and we're looking at the sequel to it, inasmuch as Luke records the history of Jesus, what he said, what he did, etc. Similarly, Luke goes on then to talk about the body of Christ at work in the world in the wake of his departure. Now, you know that Jesus appeared in the flesh. He was born according to the New Testament text. He grew up as a Jew. He was crucified, buried, and resurrected, and he ascended to the Father, only to then send his Spirit, according to the telling in the 2nd chapter of Acts, upon believers, and thus firing up this body of Christ in some sense. though Jesus himself is not here in the flesh, working through an earth suit as he did for some season in his life. Now he does this through others that are regenerated by him. And Luke is going to tell the story of the early church, this fledgling community getting up on its feet, beginning in Judea and then expanding outward. What's interesting, that Luke would be the principal teller of the story of the early church, and he tells the largest. If you look at the four Gospels, his is the biggest book in the New Testament. It's the largest Gospel. What's interesting is he wasn't an original. If you look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only two were written by originals. The Johannine Gospel is the Gospel of John. He was an original. And the Matthean Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew was an original. Originally named Levi, he had joined this apostolic troop and becomes one of the 12. Mark once was not an original. Mark is in effect writing Peter's reminiscences. And Luke wasn't an original. He comes many years later. In fact, speaking of years later, it's interesting to me that Paul is the principal interpreter of the New Testament story of Jesus. You have the Gospels that talk about what Jesus said and did, but what it means individually, and then what it means corporately for individuals that have been touched by the story, is particularly articulated in the Pauline corpus, that is, the body of literature that bears Paul's name. And what's interesting about that for my money is Paul was not an original apostle. He never heard a single parable roll off of Jesus' lips, never drank any water turned to wine, never ate any fish multiplied or any bread multiplied on any hillside. He not only was not part of the original group, he was trying to kill them when the story all began. But then if you can't beat him, join him. He's going to wind up accepting the Lord through some very interesting providential encounter on the road to Damascus. And then he will go for a number of years. Paul is a latecomer. He tells us in Acts that he will spend years. If you look at Acts and Galatians and conflate those, Paul's testimony, he comes to faith, he spends time at Damascus, 3 years in Arabia, then 15 days, according to Galatians 1, in Jerusalem, then off to Tarsus in Turkey for 10 years until Barnabas in Jerusalem hears of a revival in Syria, and then he's going to go pick up Paul in Tarsus on the way there. They're going to minister, and then it's some 14 years into the, after his accepting the Lord, where he's going to be launched in his endeavors westward to begin to break new ground in the Greco-Roman world. He will have his first missionary journey. He'll pick up Luke on the second. So there's been a lot of water under the bridge before Luke writes the history of this early church and the Gospel of Luke. And what's worth noting again is that Luke was there for none of the original Jesus story. Luke tells us as much, by the way, if you look at the beginning of his writings, and we'll do that later, that he says, inasmuch as others have undertaken to provide a telling of the things that have been said and done, so I too have similarly applied myself. Luke tells us that he's aware of other documents, that he's gathered them, in fact, and that when he's offering a teaching, a telling of the life of Jesus, he has no firsthand knowledge of this. He's a historian. He does historiography. He's gathering together documents, and he is papering them up and adding narrative, particularly that is useful in the ministry for Paul. And I'm going to consider that with you as we make our way through the Gospel of Luke and then to what's called Acts of the Apostles, which is a misnomer, it's a mistake. Maybe the acts of the Spirit working through apostles. The apostles aren't mentioned collectively but at the beginning, but the term the Spirit this and the Spirit that some 70 times in the document. So maybe the acts of the Spirit. But never mind the Luke Acts documents for a moment. I'm going to turn to my own, a little syllabus here, and tell you a little what we're game to do and how we're game to do it in this little mini course. As the title informs, this MJBI video-modular will briefly survey Luke Acts. And when I say brief, I mean brief, that this is, in effect, a sampler. As are all these courses at the end of the day. I hope it'll just stimulate your own juices to want to penetrate further and to study more. That's all it can ever be anyway. Even if you get a doctoral degree in these things, it's You don't develop expertise, just more familiarity than most. And hopefully, the word scholar comes from a Latin word meaning in school. Hopefully, you'll learn a lot of things in this course, but particularly the thing you'll learn is how much you didn't know and how much there is to know. And thus you'll be motivated to be a lifelong learner, not thinking yourself an expert. Well, here we're going to briefly survey Luke Acts, and we'll consider Jesus' rise as with that of the early Messianic Jewish faith movement, practice, and experience. That's not beyond the pale of reason. We're looking at Jesus gathering Jews together in Judea. While that's true, do consider that if you look at the Gospel of Luke as well as Acts, it's not really about what God is doing amongst Jews. Well, it certainly entertains that story. But for very practical purposes, remember that Paul is particularly game to take the gospel beyond Judea. And so he and Luke with him are very interested in offering a telling of the Jesus story in a way that would not offend the sensibilities of non-Jews, of Greco-Romans out there in the broader culture, some of whom might be suspicious of Jewish people, looking at Jews as, strange, barbaric lot. There were racial prejudices then as now, and there is something scandalous saying, here I'm telling you a story, the boss of my movement was the one who was condemned by the Romans a few years ago, but listen, I can explain everything. We're not really a subversive group. Our boss was executed on the basis of suspicions of covert activity, of looking to overthrow the Roman Empire, and there's a sense in which if you're going to offer a telling of Jesus' crucifixion, you really need to have some explaining to do. And arguably Luke is game to paper up the story in a way that's not offensive to Roman moorings. In fact, just to illustrate briefly on the front end, if you look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark has no baby Jesus story. John has no baby Jesus story. Luke and Matthew do baby Jesus stories. The Matthew baby Jesus story is played out against the backdrop of this wicked King Herod, who is just a maniac who's slaughtering babies. And Luke says none of that. Luke's Christmas story is not played out against the backdrop of political intrigue and social unrest and, nefarious king. And why is that? Because Herod was appointed by the Romans. You don't want to present yourself as some rabble-rouser discontents that are casting aspersions at Roman administrative decisions about ruling a colony. If you look at the Lucan Christmas story, it's played out against the backdrop of, it's very genteel by nature, shepherds having some angelic visitation and so forth. It's interesting, by the way, if you look at the angle. Another thing that's interesting about the angle, particularly in the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute. In the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute, we're trying to teach something new. That is, new, I say that tongue-in-cheek. I really don't teach anything new, just teach things that have been forgotten with the passage of time. And what's been forgotten is that principally the Jesus story is a Jewish story. And it has evolved out of Israel's borders in time and space, and now people have forgotten the Jewish roots of the faith. And so now the name of the game is to help people understand its Jewishness, how it's appropriate for Jewish people, and how it's best understood in Jewish culture. This is our project today. This was not Paul's project. Paul wasn't trying to help people to understand how the gospel is a very Jewish story. It's fit for Jews. And the reason is because all of the constituents prior to him were Jewish. He was trying to say how this story works for non-Jews. And so we're kind of like ships passing in the night. In as much as I'm game to want to help people explore how Jesus is appropriate for Jews, Paul was particularly game to explore, and Luke in conjunction with him, how this Jesus story is acceptable for those that are of non-Jewish extract. In any case, when we look at Luke, Luke is very selective in exploring stories that are apropos for non-Jews. Similarly, the sequel to Luke, Luke Volume 2, what's called the Acts of the Apostles, is principally about expanding the gospel into non-Jewish hearts and heads and hearts, the head first and then it makes the journey. In any case, when we look at the Jesus story, we're looking at a story that's principally played out amongst Jews. But as we follow our story here, we'll note how as this story morphs, as it expands beyond Israel's borders, out into the Greco-Roman world, how, the name of the game is to offer a telling that shows how it's fit for consumption with non-Jews. An introductory course, this is designed to complement other MJBI courses led by the instructor, yours truly, as well as others. Now, you can survey the samplings of courses, and there are a variety of them. And all of this is designed to get theological education to you. The MJBI is fascinating in the sense the name of the game is to gather voices from theologians of Jewish extract with Jewish affinities still, who are game to want to explore the Jesus story with a Jewish set of eyes. And they're individual eccentric theologians like me. There are well-known Messianic rabbis. And the name of the game is to gather this and dispense it, thinking that it provides a service that wouldn't otherwise be there. Well, this course is designed to complement what other Messianic theologues are doing, but I've taught a few courses here on early church history. Well, one, an overview of church history. One, a look at Messianic Jewish experience as it evolves through the first 4 centuries. Here, I'm not looking to evolve out of the first century, so I'm narrowing the focus still. But we're looking at historiography. We're trying to understand something of the beginnings of what we call Christianity, and even the pre-beginnings of that, the Messianic Jewish experience. Well, this course is designed to complement other MJBI courses that I've been involved in and others, which provided both an overview of the whole of church history and looked specifically at nascent Messianic Jewish experience in the 1st through 4th centuries. Though related, as I'd said, this inquiry focuses on Luke's cosmopolitan telling of the life and teachings of Jesus. And by the word cosmopolitan, I mean the word cosmopolitan comes from the word cosmos, and cosmos speaks of the world, the universe, if you will. I mention that because, as I'd said, Luke is particularly game to explore how Jesus is fit for consumption by non-Jews. And then we not only observe this in the Lucan telling of the gospel, but then similarly in the sequel to it, as we look at the expansion, all that's explored some. So hopefully upon completion, you'll be better able to understand Luke's word and his world, and Paul's, the one for whom he is writing. So that's what we have on the menu to do. I want to suggest a course textbook, but I do so very tentatively because, goodness, this program goes all over the world, and you might not have access to books, the same. I want you to get some book that looks at the New Testament. I've, as a Bible college professor, worked with a book by Gundry, published by Zondervan, a survey of the New Testament. I think he does a good job of introducing Luke and Acts as well as the whole of the New Testament, though he's not particularly game to look at it from a Messianic Jewish perspective. In fact, he seems rather insensitive to that. But we don't live in a perfect world. I think he does a good job. You might want to acquire as well David Stern's commentary on the New Testament, a real classic in our world, and there are others as well that have endeavored to offer Jewish views on the good news. But I want you to get a hold of something, imperfect as it might be, simply because I want you to familiarize yourself with the Gospel of Luke, and then to allow yourself to be informed by the sage insights that others might bring to bear. Even if you wouldn't agree with everything, you would agree that it's good to be able to hear from other people. And so I offer a textbook humbly here, Robert Gundry's book on a survey of the New Testament. But if that's not available in your language or in your culture, well then get a hold of something. Minimally read the Gospel of Luke and read the book of Acts, to be sure. Course requirements, well, you have to listen to this talking head for 16 segments. Don't worry, one of them is over in 5 minutes. And that counts for 25%. I want you to read a book on Luke and Acts, something besides Luke and Acts. Just make your way to a commentary, go online, just load up on information. Well, I don't agree with what that other person is saying. It's okay. The mark of a scholar is developing the aptitude to think with somebody else's mind. You can say, well, here's, Dr. So-and-so understand such and such, and I in a very gentlemanly or gentle, womanly way disagree for this reason, but at least to familiarize yourself with a broader constellation of thoughts on these subjects. So that way you have some measure of mastery of it. Not, well, here's what I feel and the world be damned. You know, you want to be able to broaden your perspective. So I want you to do that. And then I have a 25 question exam as well. So the 25 question exam is worth 50%, reading a book on your own 25%, listening to the talking head 25%, and that's how we add up to 100 in this. There's a little something on the syllabus about the instructor, just so you know who's talking to you. I am a Jewish believer in Jesus, came to faith some years ago. I've been involved in ministry, pastoring congregations of different sorts for years. I've been a Bible college seminary professor for years, 23 years as of this moment when I'm standing in front of the camera. Similarly, I have a career in law enforcement as a police officer, detective. That doesn't turn you off, I hope. In fact, I approach the biblical inquiry like a detective, in as much as you're trained to walk into a crime scene. Of course, you weren't there when the event happened. Could have happened an hour beforehand, a day, a week beforehand. You just weren't there. But there's a theory, if you learn to look, you can gather evidence and at least come up with a tentative hypothesis to reconstruct what happened there. And you'll have a tentative hypothesis, and then you'll send the gun out for sampling as well as DNA testings and so forth. There's ways to lift DNA, there's ways to get fibers, there's ways to send things out. You meet with the group after you attend to the crime scene, after you document and gather your information and photograph and do your sketches, and then, you know, the detectives get together and kind of sort of brief or debrief to offer some kind of sense of what we think happened, and then you send out your evidence to see if the evidence, if the physical evidence, when it's tested, corroborates their hypothesis. I mention that only to say that there's a process of what makes you a detective is you can look at something and you look at it carefully, and maybe you can see things other people don't see. I say that because what I want to do here is, as we look at Luke and Acts, it's not going to be Sife's, you know, favorite sermons designed to inspire you, and I'm not like that. I'm doing this as a detective. I want to enter into the literature and put different sets of eyes on it. If you're just going to hear good preaching, you don't need me. Just go to church on Sunday or Saturday or whenever you do it. But what I want to do here is press. I want to give you tools. I want to give you new ways of thinking. I want to develop some sense of what happened back then. You're going to, in the next segment, begin to see something of an analytical approach to the Gospel of Luke in conversation with Mark and Matthew. We're going to explore some of that, and I'll introduce you to new language, to new concepts. In fact, it'll be a little while still till we get to the Gospel of Luke. Though I'm working on it, I need to build a platform which to help you to better understand it. What do I mean by that? Well, you'll have to come back after you take your break and find out. The name of the game here, as I'd said, is to do 16 segments. This one introduces, the 16th concludes, and in between, the name of the game is to go on a journey. I'm sure you have a lot of things happening in your life, but I want you to say goodbye to them, if you will, and go with me on a journey, enter into a time machine, and we'll go back and we'll see if we can better understand Luke and Paul, and we'll see, you'll have to see the extent to which it makes a difference to you, to your life and ministry. I can't answer that question, but I can say as I close, thank you so much for going with me on the journey.